Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon. I'm saying this for the tape. I'm Margaret M. Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Divinity School, and I teach New Testament and Ancient Christianity. Those of you who are here visiting today as a part of our open house at the beginning of this morning at the very early hour of 8:30, I welcome you on behalf of the faculty of the Divinity School, and this is one moment in the day when you'll get a chance to see the Divinity School faculty on parade and engage with one another about a faculty book. A convention that we have at least once a quarter, I think. We have a Dean's Forum in which a faculty book is the center, and then individual colleagues whose work is sometimes related to, but sometimes not that closely related to the book, interact with it, and that's our subject today. Before I introduce our esteemed panel and this dialogue, I want to just say that it's a convention in Swift Hall where our student chefs make us an extraordinary vegetarian meal that we always thank the chefs before we do anything else. Nora Khan and the team. And this is a Wednesday lunch. I know it's on Thursday, but already back in the early 80s when I was a student here, we had a tradition of Wednesday lunch that still carries forward, and it's always a wonderful meal in the middle of the week together with some kind of program. Often it's a talk. At other times it's a musical performance or other kinds of things. So this is your Thursday, Wednesday lunch. And then at the end, if you would, just fold your chairs. That's a big help. And we try to compost in the back. We have fantastic student leadership, both on the cooking crew and in our coffee shop, that are leading, together with our Greening the Div School group, us in trying to be a better sustainable community, and that begins here with Wednesday lunch. So a few instructions about how you can join that effort at the end of this meal. Nora? Okay, then let's begin. For this Dean's Forum today, we have a focus on Catherine Brekus's book, Sarah Osborne's World, The Rise of Evangelical Christianity in Early America, Yale University Press, 2013. I'm going to first introduce the two respondents and then Professor Brekus, and then Professor Brekus will say a few words, Professor Schreiner, Professor Hammerschlag, and then we'll have dialogue and questions as we have time, concluding no later than 1:20. Susan E. Schreiner is professor of the history of Christianity and theology in the Divinity School. Her most recent book, or if I can say tome, at 500 pages, is entitled Are You Alone Wise? The Search for Certainty in the Early Modern Era. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2010. The book focuses on the various epistemological and theological debates from Occam to Shakespeare, including Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, Münster, Frank, Hubmaier, Teresa of Avila, Montaigne, and Shakespeare. This book was the featured subject of the conference of the Society for Reformation Studies in Cambridge, England last year in April, and it was part of the Ferrari Festival of the Humanities at Rochester University last spring on the subject of reformations in Western thought. We're very pleased that Professor Schreiner will be the first respondent today. Sarah Hammerschlag is the author of the book The Figural Jew, Politics and Identity in Post-War France, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2010. This book received an honorable mention award from the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award in the category of philosophy and Jewish thought. She is currently working on a book on the intersections of philosophy, religion, and literature, and Professor Hammerschlag joined the Divinity School faculty just this fall. And so it's really great that you agreed to do a response, Sarah, in the first quarter. So everyone is really eager to have you in the conversation, and this is one such moment. Catherine A. Brekus is the author of Strangers and Pilgrims, Female Preaching in America, 1740 to 1845. That book won the Frank and Elizabeth Brewer Prize for the best first book in the history of Christianity from the American Society of Church History. Professor Brekus, who holds the position of Professor of Religions of America, and the History of Christianity in the Divinity School, and is Associate Faculty in the Department of History in the Social Sciences Division in the university, is also the editor of The Religious History of American Women, Reimagining the Past, and most recently with Clark Gilpin, emeritus of our faculty, American Christianities, A History of Dominance and Diversity. The book we're here to discuss today has just recently been awarded the 2013 John Wesley Honors College of Indiana Wesleyan University's Aldersgate Prize. So it's already being widely discussed. Before Professor Brekus says a few words of introduction, I'm going to take chair's privilege to let you hear a little bit of the voice of this book.
Oh, I was going to.
I'm going to take chair's privilege, and I'm going to elbow Susan Schreiner out of the way.
That's all right, because I lost the quote I was going to use. So
okay.
go ahead.
All right. Well, you'll find it in the meantime, but one of the things about this book, which is an intellectual, social, cultural biography and study of an early American woman, one of the extraordinary things about the book is how beautifully written it is and how it draws one in. And so I want you to hear it a bit. Sorry.
You really are. That's my first page. But
Let's take the microphone away from Professor Schreiner. So, in personam, Catherine Brekus. When Sarah Osborne died in 1796 at the age of 82, frail and nearly blind, she left behind few possessions of value: a gold locket, a silver spoon inscribed with her second husband's initials, a maple desk. But more precious in her opinion were the thousands of diary pages she had sewn together into neat booklets, each marked with a number and a date. Even after more than 2 centuries, her tight stitches have never come unraveled. On the cover of one of her diaries, she bequeathed her words to, quote, the disposal of Providence, close quote. Her most cherished hope was that someday her manuscripts would be read by people who shared her hunger to communicate with a personal, majestic, sovereign God. More than 2 centuries later, her writings can help transport us back to the world of 18th century America, a world that has much to say to our own. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brekus to the podium.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here, and especially welcome to those of you who are visiting for the first time. I've met a number of you this morning, and it's really fun hearing about your interests, and it's wonderful to see such a good turnout for this occasion. I'm really honored to have my book be part of your visit today, and I think maybe the best thing to do might be to just describe it a little bit, tell you about how I got started on this project. I'm assuming that my 2 colleagues here will be probably talking more about the arguments. This is a book that really started a long time ago. I was still in graduate school. I was working on my dissertation. I was having a lot of difficulty finding sources. I was writing about female preachers. And I decided that I was going to just go to the rare book library and read anything having to do with women in religion. And so this was long enough ago that there were still card catalogs. This was not electronic. I was actually leafing through the card catalog. And I saw a card that said Sarah Osborne, Memoir and Diaries. So I called it up. And I can almost just still see myself sitting at this desk in Beinecke, which is a beautiful library filled with light. And I take out these very small manuscripts that are about this big, where you can still see the stitching on the side, as Dean Mitchell just read. And I start reading them. And the first thing I take out is her memoir, which she wrote in 1743. She was a very intelligent woman, but she was not well educated, and she did not know how to use punctuation. So reading this memoir was like a stream of consciousness read, where I started reading, and it was very hard to figure out where to stop. And her voice was so compelling that I just kept going. Sarah Osborne, most of you probably have never heard of her before. There have been one or two scholarly articles. So if you haven't heard of her, you shouldn't be embarrassed. This is not some major gap in your education. She was a school teacher in Newport, Rhode Island. She was born in England, came to the colonies when she was 9 years old, ended up settling in Newport, where she lived for her whole life. And during the revivals of the so-called Great Awakening in the early 1740s, she became a convert to what we now call evangelical Christianity. The word evangelical in the 18th century was used as an adjective, but not as a noun. So she would say, I'm praying for evangelical repentance. It isn't until the 19th century that the word evangelical really becomes a description of a group of Christians. So she wrote this memoir in 1743 where she tells the story of her life, and she tries to explain how it is that she came to be saved, how she was redeemed. She followed that with diaries really up until the 1770s, where she was writing in these very small booklets that she sewed together. Most of her diaries are devotional in nature. There's very little about her ordinary life. I would love to know how this woman did laundry or childcare, or some of the practical things that as a women's historian I'm interested in. But most of her diaries are like written prayers to God, where she's writing about her spiritual state, where she's asking for guidance and protection. This is a woman who had an extremely difficult life. She had a suicidal crisis in her youth. She ran away with a sailor when she was only 17, and much to her parents' disapproval. Ended up having a child really very young. Her husband died at sea. She started teaching school to try to make ends meet. Imagine what it was like being a single mother in the 18th century. Eventually remarried a tailor who was almost 30 years older than she was. He had some kind of mental and physical breakdown, which made it impossible for him to work. So she was then supporting herself, her son, him, and his 3 sons. And through all this, she had some kind of illness, some kind of chronic illness, which my best guess, based on what she writes in her diaries, is that she had either MS or rheumatoid arthritis. So unfortunately, she lived till 1796, but my last written records from her are in the 1770s, because she almost entirely lost her eyesight and was unable to walk and couldn't keep these diaries anymore. In the beginning, I was just fascinated by her voice, by her story, by the sort of intensity of her religious emotion. But over time, I began to fashion this into some kind of scholarly project. And what the book is about, the book tells the story of the rise of the evangelical movement through her eyes. I identify her as one of the first evangelicals in America. She belonged to the first generation, I think, of this new movement that we still see today. And as I was reading her diaries, I was really struck by her language, which I was trying to identify where certain words or why certain topics were so important to her. And what I ended up arguing in the book is that what we can see in her diaries and in the diaries of other evangelicals is that evangelicalism emerged in the 18th century in dialogue with the Enlightenment. And that certain Enlightenment ideas, especially the emphasis on firsthand experience as the basis of knowledge, were really woven into evangelicalism. And so rather than seeing the evangelical movement as somehow anti-modern or opposed to modernity, I see it as a vector of modernity in the same way that liberal Protestantism is. So I see Christianity as being transformed by Enlightenment ideas in multiple ways. One vector takes us to liberal Protestantism. Another vector, I think, takes us to evangelical Protestantism, with obviously a different set of emphases, especially on experience as the basis for knowledge. Evangelicalism is built on the idea that you can know God through the experience of conversion. And so part of the reason that Sarah Osborne was writing all of these diaries is so that she could write down her experiences and examine them for evidence of the way God was guiding her life. So this was really a labor of love. This is a book I think that I wanted to work on multiple levels, and we'll see how I did. That I wanted it to be a story of an 18th century woman's life, but I also wanted it to be an examination of the rise of evangelicalism in dialogue with the Enlightenment.
I lost the first page, so I'm winging it. I now know, I was going to start by saying I didn't know, but now I know how Professor Brekus found Sarah Osborne. I, among many other people, had never heard of her, and I wondered where you had come across her. Where was she sitting? Where did you find her? And I would like to say that we are extremely fortunate that Professor Brekus did find Sarah Osborne and has brought her very much back to life. I want to start, there are many things that we can learn from this book, and I'm only going to mention a few. But one of them, Professor Mitchell has already alluded to, is the fact that this book is beautifully written. And I think that's important and instructive beyond the fact that it's simply beautifully written. It's because academics can't write, okay? Academics think writing means that you use the most obscure and technical terms possible, and you end up being pretentious as hell. And I would just like to point out that we learn an enormous amount about this era in a book that truly reads like a novel. Just as examples, some of you will know that these are my pet peeves, others won't. Professor Brekus never uses impact as a verb. She never confuses historic and historical. And most of all, thank God, she never uses the word problematic as a noun. I have yet to understand the difference between a problem and a problematic, okay? Now, the reason this is important is because it means that Sarah is not hidden from us behind a lot of jargon that is so tempting to academic writers because, well, or as a result, it places the author who's using this jargon in an allegedly superior position to the reader. Instead, because it is so beautifully written, Sarah comes to us directly so that we actually feel the life that this woman led. And we feel the atmosphere of Newport, 18th century Newport, Rhode Island. I mean, we sense what it's like to be living in poverty and during wartime. We sort of sense the noise and the conversations on the streets, the change of seasons. We feel the harshness of the winters. We understand on a personal level the ambivalence towards slavery. So we feel, in a way, as I was reading this, as if I was sort of sitting in the corner watching Sarah quietly writing at her desk and struggling to find the words that would explain her life. We also learn many things about this historical era. And we learn them in this beautiful language. We learn how Puritanism evolved into a Calvinist evangelicalism, which permeated the life and the thought of Sarah Osborne and many like her. We learn about living, as I said, through war and the troubling issue of slavery. Equally important, we learn what it was like to believe in the redemptive power of suffering and to accept one's life as directed by the providence of God. Actually, we also learn something that is so important to understanding this era. We learned that this was a time, and I think this is too strong a word, but the conflict of cultures. As she said, evangelicalism was born in a dialogue with the Enlightenment. So you have this Calvinist evangelicalism, you have, and she's much too smart to call it the Enlightenment, but that's what I have to, I mean, there is no such thing as the Enlightenment, but we're just going to say it. The Enlightenment, a movement called humanitarianism, and, of course, as I said, Calvinist evangelicalism. Such times of change, such times when movements of thought are meeting, sometimes colliding, sometimes adapting to each other, these times of change are of particular importance. And they tell us what and how we inherited our later or contemporary thinking. And such historical periods are instructive both because they demonstrate tensions and oppositions, but also because they reveal common presuppositions, similarities, influences, and adaptations that took place among these different movements or ways of viewing the world. I thought that was really one of the best or most enlightening parts of the book, is that how they would share certain vocabulary, certain ideas, although they may have interpreted them differently, certain assumptions rise up between these cultures or between these movements that are shared. Now, because this book is so well written, we're left with some views of the world that are alien to us in many ways, because we sense these movements on their own terms, and it's not the way we think many times today. As Professor Brekus says at the outset of her book, I forget who you're citing, history is alien to us, they did things differently back then. We're also invited, however, because of these various views of the world that are evident in the life of Newport and Sarah Osborne, we're also invited to reflect on the various beliefs that are coming into being or are existing. And as I said, because this book is written so clearly, it was rather difficult to find any specific questions to ask our author, but I found several.
I'm sure you did.
No, it was hard. It was hard. This is really hard. I mean, I would put you right up there with Peter Brown on beautiful writing. I don't have that skill. I'm not as bad as impact as a verb, but I mean, I'm not good. I have two questions, rather small, for Professor Brekus, and I have one question for all of us to just think about. We don't have to answer. You will know my answer, but you don't have to. Now, I have asked Professor Brekus this first question about 1,000 times, so when she rolls her eyes, just ignore that. I'm hoping that I can finally understand it if I frame it in this particular way. Will you again do me the favor of explaining the main aspects of today's evangelicalism by contrasting it with the evangelicalism of the 18th century embodied by Sarah Osborne? She's rolling her eyes. Secondly, you mentioned this tension between Enlightenment and evangelical thinkers regarding the issue of happiness. Now, anyone who's taken any of my classes knows I just hate people who want to be happy. I think it's one of the most destructive things about our culture. But Professor Gamwell always reminds me, now, Susan, happiness didn't mean the same thing back then as it means now. So I would like to ask Professor Brekus to do me the favor of explaining what happiness meant to the thinkers, particularly of the Enlightenment and the humanitarian movements. And now I have a question that the book, I think, poses to all of us. On page 341, Professor Brekus states, quotes, "By the end of the 19th century, Sarah Osborne seemed like an anachronism, a relic of the past that few would remember. Now, it's important for us to remember that Sarah was a Calvinist. This was Calvinist evangelicalism. Now, I know that you think today is Halloween, but more importantly, it's also Reformation Day, which I teach. It is the celebration of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation when Luther posted the 95 Theses. And if you belong to a strict Reformed world, which I do not, you are not allowed to send your kids trick-or-treating on Reformation Day. Anyway, it is worth recalling that this is Reformation Day, so it's also worth recalling that, like Lutherans, Calvinists such as Sarah Osborne saw the world and human nature in ways that we might find somewhat anachronistic. She saw the world, and I'm using Professor's words, as fallen and broken. She believed in a deterministic providence of God. She believed in original sin, and she held to an unblinking belief in human depravity. This most likely means that Sarah remains an anachronism to many people today. But what if Sarah could come back today, walk in the room, and join our conversation? After all, she hoped that her works would be published and would prove to be inspiring. So if she were here and she could look back at the centuries that divide us, especially the 20th century, would her darker views of the world and human nature be contradicted or confirmed? As Professor Brekus explains, Sarah lived in times of great changes. Changes in politics, economics, science, and technology that laid the foundations for the modern world. And this book traces the way that Sarah's beliefs were under attack by a growing faith in human goodness and individual freedom, in free will, and the sufficiency of reason. So looking back, would history support Sarah, or would it support the newer ideas of the Enlightenment? Professor Brekus helpfully characterizes the Enlightenment movements by saying, quotes, "Among these changes of technology, science, etc., there were new currents of thought that historians have termed the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that was premised on the assumption that individuals had the freedom to create a better world." Then, citing Peter Gay, she continues by saying, "The Enlightenment was committed to freedom in its many forms. Freedom from arbitrary power, freedom of speech, freedom of trade, freedom to realize one's own talents, freedom of aesthetic response, freedom, in a word, of moral man to make his own way in the world." She concludes by saying that the Enlightenment thinkers hoped to liberate people from the shackles of the past by insisting that every hypothesis about human nature and society be tested by both reason and experience. With its critical spirit, its faith in progress, and its celebration of the individual, the Enlightenment marked the creation of our modern world, unquote. So if Sarah were here, I will just suggest that I think she would rather sarcastically ask, "How's that working out for you?" But this excellent book asks us to answer this question on our own.
Well, the good thing about going last is that I can now edit my piece and make sure that I find any place where I potentially used impact as a verb.
Technically, it is a verb, but in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's still disputed.
And of course, the bad part about going last is that some of the praise that I am about to lavish on Professor Brekus has already been lavished, so I apologize for the repetition. Thank all of you also for being here today, and Dean Mitchell for convening this, and Catherine Brekus for such a beautiful book. Each chapter of Catherine Brekus's book, Sarah Osborne's World, opens with a passage from Sarah Osborne's writings, from her diaries, memoirs, or letters. It's thus her voice, the voice of an 18th century evangelical Christian woman living in Newport, Rhode Island, writing between the 1740s and the 1770s, living until the 1790s, that guides the work. And it's the fidelity to that voice and to Sarah's vision, a respect for Sarah's words and for the perspective they disclose, that are at the heart of this historical work. From her singular history, Brekus reveals the complexities and nuance of American evangelicalism as it emerged from Puritan Calvinism by the end of the 18th century. Even as Brekus allows us to become immersed in this world, in Sarah's world, we never lose sight of the historian, whose voice and perspective accompany her subject. It is Brekus's taught prose, which provides the book with the literary force of a novel, and her intelligence, which endows the work with nuance, balance, and insight. In the extraordinary range of the book's detail, which include everything from the price of firewood in the 1750s, to verses from a volume of children's hymns in the 1740s, to the actual text and even the visual of an advertisement for a runaway slave in the 1760s, we get a sense not only for pre-revolutionary New England, but also for the devotion of this scholar, who, beginning with really fragments of Sarah's diaries, constructs a fully wrought portrait of Sarah and her environment. Brekus allows the reader to think and see with Sarah Osborne, to follow the machinations of her logic, fully respecting both her ordeals and triumphs without ever losing the critical distance of the historian, who must not only reveal her subject's world, but analyze it and evaluate it. In chapter 2, to give you an example, which is entitled The Name of Christ, Brekus provides the backdrop of Sarah's childhood by weaving together Calvinist doctrine of sin, early American catechisms, and speeches by the movement's most prominent Puritan ministers, who described children as fountains of sin and evil treasures. In so doing, Brekus builds towards the chapter's main event. Sarah, at the age of 8, falls into the hearth, burning and blistering her hand. When Sarah reflects on the incident as God's punishment, punishing her for playing on the Sabbath, I could, in fact, taste the fear of damnation that children of Sarah's milieu must have carried with them. And at the same time, I found myself contemplating the interactions between children and adults of our own era. I think, since this is a commonality, the way in which this book makes you think about our own world. Brekus' work thus yields that prize proper to great history. She discloses the inner logic of her object of study, thus making the strange familiar, but at the same time making the familiar strange, allowing us to contemplate our own moment with a really newfound critical distance. With each chapter, we take a step forward in Sarah Osborne's extraordinary life, as she moves into adulthood, is widowed, undergoes a conversion experience, remarries, loses her son, becomes one of the only published women in colonial America, and leads a revival in the 1760s that brings together evangelicals of multiple denominations and welcomes into her home slaves as well as slaveholders. At the same time, Brekus uses each moment as a means toward elucidating a different historical theme. Covering Sarah Osborne's financial struggles, for example, she gives us an economic breakdown of Newport, Rhode Island's Christian communities and analyzes the transition in New England from mercantile capitalism to a market economy. Describing Sarah's transition from slaveholder to abolitionist, Brekus provides an analysis of early American attitudes on slavery, comparing an Enlightenment perspective that accommodated a doctrine of racial inferiority, along with an espousal of human equality, to an evangelical perspective which oscillated between replicating a theological hierarchy in society and struggling with the morality of holding a fellow Christian in bondage. Even as each chapter synchronically dilates on a single theme, the narrative itself tracks changes in colonial American attitudes from the 1740s to the 1790s. Across this narrative, I see Brekus working out three interrelated arguments that actually transcend Sarah's life and significance. We're all, in some sense, so enraptured by the details of her life that it's actually a temptation to get caught up in this sort of novelistic quality. But there are, I think, some very robust arguments that are being made here. So let me just elucidate them. I have to find my place again. The first concerns the status of the Enlightenment in the development of evangelical Christianity. Rather than assuming an easy contrast between an optimistic Enlightenment humanism and a Calvinist theology emphasizing human depravity and submission to the rod of God's discipline, Brekus complicates the nexus of influence by showing how the language of progress and an emphasis on empirical data and experience infuses early evangelical self-understanding, making the conversion experience the locus of certainty. Additionally, she makes a subtle argument for the progressive and subversive potential arising from a Christian anthropology emphasizing sin and submission. Without endorsing Sarah's worldview, Brekus shows us how Sarah gains prominence in her community not by asserting her equality, but by marveling that God had made such a weak vessel, a poor nothing creature, as Sarah calls herself, the vehicle for this message. The same logic is at work in Brekus' explanation of how Sarah's movement empowered African converts to Christianity to buy their way into freedom and helped turn the movement under the leadership of Samuel Hopkins toward an anti-slavery position. Without ever questioning a racialist paradigm, the community was brought to financially support the education at the College of New Jersey of John Kwamine, I don't know if I'm saying that right, a former slave kidnapped in Ghana, because of the zeal of his faith and his motivation to bring Christianity back to his compatriots in Africa. God is thus glorified in his power to speak through the poorest and most humble of his servants. Finally, the third argument that I see animating the project is in fact methodological. By focusing on the diaries and letters of a woman whose life was often caught up with the management of her household, her attempts to keep the family out of poverty, and a congregation plagued by a minister with a drinking problem, Brekus resists the distinction between social and political history, or social and intellectual history. Religion emerges as the connective tissue that binds the private to the public, the individual to the cosmic, giving Sarah's most personal struggles the gravity of theological conundrums. Here, the Hebrew Bible is an important mediator. By processing her own experience through those of Job and David, Hannah, and Samuel, the death of a child becomes the occasion for theological inquiry into the nature of divine election. The matter of whether or not to raise tuition at her school, the source of a meditation on the nature of brotherly love, and the pain of physical suffering, the sign of God's presence. Brekus concludes by drawing continuity between Sarah Osborne's vision and that of modern-day evangelicals. So here, I'm afraid I'm coming awfully close to your question. Writing, even as the evangelical movement has changed since the 18th century, crucial features remain the same. Evangelicals have always struggled to define their relation to the modern world, but they have never lost their missionary zeal, their sense of assurance, their reliance on the Bible, their determination to draw strict lines between Christians and unbelievers, and their emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus. Nor have they ever doubted that sinners must be born again. For more than 2 centuries, they have shared the same conviction that stood at the heart of Sarah's life. A broken world needs to be redeemed by Christ. So I was struck by this passage, coming at the very end of the book's epilogue, by its emphasis on missionary zeal, self-assurance, and the strict boundary between true believers and, I suppose, what else is there but the damned. And I couldn't help note the intolerance that would seem to be the natural outgrowth of these qualities. And I was struck by the fact that by focusing on Sarah's doubts and trials, her fears for her unconverted son, for her own shifting position on slavery, and her remorse over past deeds, this was not, in fact, the attitude that seemed to emerge from Brekus' portrait. To me, this represents both an achievement and a conundrum of the book. So I'd like to ask a series of related questions that arise out of this contrast. First, I'm wondering whether the contrast is itself intentional on your part, or whether it can be explained historically or methodologically, whether it's a product of an exercise in sympathetic understanding, one which insists as much as possible is reading Sarah's experience in her own terms, or whether it's a matter of analyzing the evangelical movement in Sarah's moment versus our own. Second, I'm wondering about the choices you made to prioritize Sarah's perspective and her contemporaries much of the time, but then occasionally privileging and asserting your own perspective. In light of the former, I'm thinking, for example, of the last page of the book when you write that her friends thought of her as a saint because of her humility, generosity, and ethic of self-sacrifice. Your emphasis on the judgment of her contemporaries seems to hint at a potentially other explanation for her dynamism and persuasive power, but this is an explanation that you choose not to explore. And then there are moments in which you take a clearly delineated position of critique towards her early attitudes on slavery, in response to a semi-unrepentant attitude toward an early theft from her parents, or merely by reading her early hopelessness and suicidal tendencies as a product of repressed rage toward her parents. How and why did you make the choices that you made in these moments, in one case to respect the worldview and perspective of your subject as authoritative, and in the next to assert the perspective of the modern historian? What was the rationale or set of criteria you used in making these decisions? And finally, on the theme of judgment, I was interested in the fact that the process of delineating a strict line between Christian and unbeliever, between converted and unconverted, seems to involve a process of evaluation by the community and by its leaders. And I was wondering if you could say more about this process and the criteria that were used, but also about the contrast between this form of judgment and the judgment of the historian who must choose to interpret her subjects to evaluate their claims.
Well, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I think we only have about 20 minutes, and I think I could speak for probably 2 hours about these things. And I do want to give people a chance to ask some questions. But let me just offer a few brief responses. These are, first of all, thank you so much for the generosity of these responses. Just to start with Professor Schreiner's first question, I do teach a course called Evangelicalism in America, and I guess I need to send her my syllabus. I do think that that something is created in the 18th century that we can now see as the seeds of the evangelical movement. I'm careful in the book to say, I'm using the word movement, but really in the 18th century, it's more like a kind of loose coalition of ideas that are beginning to come together. Professor Hammerschlag read one passage where I see the continuities, but I think that the emphasis on the converted individual as the locus of religious authority, the emphasis on a born-again conversion experience, I think this is so familiar that we don't realize it's new. But one thing that I do in my course on early America is I share some conversion narratives from Thomas Shepard's congregation. These are from the 1640s in Boston, and I ask students to read them. And they're always perplexed because the narratives have so much doubt in them. And they feel to us, I think, unfinished, where what they're saying is, I think I'm a Christian now. And that was enough for them to be admitted into membership. That sort of doubt is actually seen as almost sinful by evangelicals in the 1740s and 1750s. They put a much higher premium on being certain, knowing that one has been converted. And in fact, the most radical wing of the evangelical movement, the so-called separates, do have something in their sort of articles of organization that says, all doubting in a believer is sinful. This is actually, to go back to one of Sarah Hammerschlag's questions, these are moments where I feel like I can't help sort of stepping in occasionally and making my own views known. It's very difficult as a historian to I both want to respect her worldview, but also make it clear that her worldview is not my own. And to do both of those things respectfully, I think, is difficult. But so I think this emphasis on a personal conversion is probably the key piece, but I think there's also a very strong belief in progress among evangelicals that has continued today, that is still seen in sort of millennial hopes. And there are a number of other features. I think the key thing to say is that evangelicalism changes dramatically in the wake of the American Revolution, because in its early incarnations, it's mostly Calvinist. It's people who should be very familiar to Professor Schreiner coming out of studying Calvin. They emphasize the utter depravity of human beings and God's sovereignty and human helplessness. This is a very difficult worldview to support if you're trying to build a nation. Because how do you say we should give authority to the people if the people are utterly corrupt? So there's a transformation that starts to happen. This is really this is where I'm trying to bring together both the history of an individual woman and sort of the social history and intellectual history of theology. There are changes in the early 19th century in the way that even people who identified themselves as Calvinists imagine human beings. And they begin to give more scope to free will. They no longer argue on behalf of unlimited atonement, for example, but a general atonement. They say everybody has the possibility to be saved. So evangelicalism changes quite a bit, and I would say probably the most the real beneficiaries of the evangelical movement in the early 19th century are the Methodists, who preach free will. And this would have been completely anathema to Sarah Osborne. Rick Rosengarten sent me a very nice note congratulating me on getting this award from the John Wesley College, and I just think she's horrified. These Arminians are giving me a prize for her. Maybe I should start lobbying for some kind of Calvinist prize. So there are a lot of changes in evangelicalism, but I do think that there's a continuity or a thread that we can trace. And I think another piece, this is a more sociological piece, evangelicals since the 18th century have always been extremely good at using mass media, new communication techniques to spread the gospel. In the 18th century, it was printing. George Whitefield, who was this itinerant who traveled all through England, Scotland, America, sort of the Billy Graham of the 18th century. He had this just very smart technique where he might be sailing from Georgia to Boston, and he would send pieces of his personal journals ahead to Boston to be printed in the newspaper there. So that he would always say something inflammatory. He had very critical things to say about Harvard and how they were not reading the right religious thinkers. They were becoming Arminians. And so he would create a kind of buzz, a publicity buzz, before he got there. And evangelicals have always been at the forefront of any new technological development: radio, television, internet. Other liberal Protestants and Catholics could learn a lot from them in terms of communication, but it's really, I think, part of their history. I guess to go to Professor Schreiner's other question, I think, what did happiness mean in the 18th century for humanitarians and Enlightenment thinkers? Professor Schreiner will be happy to hear that it did not mean what you see on a soda commercial today, where everybody's like incredibly happy and jumping up and down because they're drinking a Coke. This was not their idea of happiness. It was something, somewhat more sober. But I think it really had to do with an individual's freedom to express, and I'm very cognizant we're talking about the 18th century, himself. Herself will come later. I think women use this language to expand their own rights, but for Enlightenment thinkers, it's the idea that an individual should be able to express himself fully, should be free to pursue one's own interests. Evangelicals were very uncomfortable with that idea of self-interest, which they saw as a mask for selfishness. If your self is primary, it means that you're not putting God first. And so they also talk about happiness, but they're very careful to say that happiness can only take place with God's grace. And you can't have true happiness if you're not a convert. To move on to some of Professor Harmerschlag's questions, which are, I'm looking forward to a lunch where she and I could talk about this in depth, because these are really interesting questions, and they really have to do with how does a historian do his or her work. And so on one hand, I really wanted to foreground Sarah Osborne's voice. As I said, this is what attracted me to the project initially. So each chapter starts with her speaking, and I want people to hear her. But I also feel like, why do we do history? We do history as a dialogue between the present and the past. And so I want to hear her on her own terms. I want to understand her and to be as empathetic as possible as I'm reading things that sometimes were disturbing to me. At the same time, I feel like as a historian, I have an obligation to take a critical stance at some points, or to explain either the strangeness of her views or the familiarity of her views. But just to give you one example, I think the most horrifying piece for me to read out of all of her letters and diaries is a piece that she wrote after her son died. He was only 11 years old. He had been apprenticed out. She was a very poor woman. She hears that he's ill, and so she rushes to be with him. And she describes this scene where she is sitting at his bedside, and she's really not concerned with whether, and she wants him to live, but what she's most concerned about is whether he's been converted or not. And so she describes how he's, really gasping for breath, and what she's doing is reading passages from books, trying to get some sign of conversion. And I know the book that she was reading, and I don't know the particular passages, but some of it is really quite frightening. Some of this book is written in sort of rhetorical questions. What would you do if your soul was about to drop into hell? And I think of her sitting, with him, possibly reading these things. After he died, she was really tormented. I think she was in such grief, but she could not come up with any evidence that he had been saved, that he'd been redeemed. And I think she was always in doubt about that. She was not sure whether her son had gone to heaven or not, and this was a deep pain in her life. This is a moment I make pretty clear, I think, in my introduction or in my epilogue, that there are many things to criticize about the Enlightenment, and as a feminist historian, I criticize many pieces, but I do not criticize the part in which Enlightenment thinkers argued that meaning could be found in everyday life, and that our relationships with family members are a kind of window into something greater than that. So this is very difficult, going back and forth between her world and ours, trying to point out where we share the same questions. I mean, I think that our questions about the meaning of human life are very similar to hers, but our answers are different. So I'm going to leave it there, and I would welcome any questions or thoughts from the audience.
I'm conscious that some of you have signed up to join classes that begin in 6 minutes, taught by some people who are right here. So I think, but I don't want to send the message that it's ever a one-way conversation in Swift Hall, and that's why our seminars are 3 hours long. But a Wednesday lunch on a Thursday is not. And so I would invite you, if you have particular questions, to come on up afterwards and talk to Professors Brekus and Schreiner. And Professor Hammerschlag will be moving pretty quickly to her class upstairs in a few minutes, but let the conversation around what you've heard today continue and not fully end, but pause here. I'd like to say to the colleagues, this was a splendid set of exchanges, and we thank you, each of you, for your role in it.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.